Good evening. How's everyone doing? Great. Great to see all of you here. It's going to be a wonderful evening. Tonight is the last in our Armenian Studies program lecture series. And for those of you that have been with us since the fall this year, we've had a pretty active year, as you well know, and we've had a variety of speakers and programs, exhibits, movies, all different kinds of things. So we're very happy this evening to conclude our Armenian Studies program lecture series with a presentation by Dr. Richard Hovannisian, who is pretty much familiar to most of you, I think, in this audience. This week was April 24th week. Last night, many of you were at the St. Gregory Fowler Church in Fowler Church, and then at lunchtime, many of you were at our Fresno State Armenian Students Organization event, and then in the morning at the flag raising, and it's been a pretty busy week with a lot of activities. But I think it's fitting that tonight we end with this lecture. It's about Armenian Kayseri, and I think, how many of you are from the region of Kayseri? So let's see your hands if you're from that region. So we have quite a few of you here from that area. Dr. Richard Hovannisian is the former Professor Emeritus, I should say, Professor Emeritus of Modern Armenian History at UCLA. He's been teaching for more than 50 years. He was also my professor, one of my professors when I was at UCLA. He has published the definitive 5-volume history of the First Republic of Armenia, and then he's edited and written a variety of other works, too numerous to name all of them, but tonight's presentation is the 12th in the series on the Armenian cities and provinces of historic Armenia. And they're based on the conferences that he held at UCLA, in which guest scholars were invited to speak on those various regions. There's still a few more to go, right? How many more are there? 3 or 4 more still to be published, and we wish him well on that, right? Dr. Hovannisian has been traveling throughout the world as a speaker. He frequently visits Armenia and has pretty much been all over the world speaking on a variety of topics. But again, I think tonight Armenian Kayseri fits in with our theme of the Armenian Genocide 99th commemoration, because almost 100 years ago these areas were also emptied of the Armenian population. Dr. Hovannisian has now in the past few years been also visiting historic Armenia with various groups, and so tonight we're going to see also some of his photographs from those areas, and then also some brief clips from the various areas that he's visited. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Hovannisian.
All right. Thank you, Barlow, and good to be back. And really, congratulations to Fresno State for having such an active program. Probably the most active that I'm aware of in our old hometown. You know, years ago, there was a priest in Yerevan whose name was Garabet Kalfayan, and some of you may remember him. A very interesting and knowledgeable man who wrote a book about his native village, which was Çomaklu. And he always used the name of Argeos. Argeos is a mountain, and while most of us in the modern age talk about Mount Ararat, and we have a picture of Mount Ararat in our home, for all the people that lived in the center of Asia Minor, it was not Ararat, but it was Argeos, and we'll see some pictures of Argeos. And as the importance of this mountain, I mean, it pulled people to it and around it. And as I visited this area with Mount Argeos and Gesaria or Kayseri, it's interesting that the whole mountain is ringed by former Armenian villages. In the north, Efkere and Germir and Talas; in the south, Evereg, Fenese, Tomarza, Çomaklu, Jujun, Incesu, and a number of others. So it's really quite interesting. If you look at the map and try to locate Gesaria or Caesarea, you see it's right in the heart of Asia Minor. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I sort of waited toward the end of this conference series to do a conference on Gesaria, because I started with very clearly cradle lands of Armenian culture and civilization, starting with Van and going on to Bitlis and Mush and Kharpert and Erzurum, and Dikranagerd and Sepasya, and then to the Black Sea communities of the Pontus, and then these very, very vibrant Armenian communities that we had in Constantinople and Smyrna. And I focused on those because they were Smyrna and Constantinople, not because they were part of historic Armenia. You see on the map they're way over in the west, but because they were very vital in the Armenian cultural Renaissance revival, along with political revival. The standard Armenian language that we speak, Western Armenian language that we speak today, is because of the efforts of the Armenian intellectuals of Constantinople and Smyrna. And then after I did all of these, I said, what have we left out? We've left out the heartland of Gesaria. And I don't want to say it was less important, but it says something about Gesaria or Caesarea lying between worlds. The Armenian world of the great highland. You know, Erzurum is 8,000 feet in height, in elevation. Kharpert is about 5,000 feet in elevation. As you come farther west you come, the lower the land gets. And so Kayseri or Gesaria was right in the middle between the coastal cities in Constantinople and Smyrna, which were important cultural, economic, and political centers, and the other side of the great Armenian highland. Armenians have made a name for themselves in Gesaria. They've been there for a very long time. Gesaria or Kayseri is not a part of the historical Armenian upland, but it's the closest province next to the Armenian highland, and for that reason there have always been Armenians there. Some of them really have made a big name for themselves. You've heard the name of Gulbenkian, multimillionaire, Mr. 5%er, the man who went on and gave huge sums of money to the Portuguese government in Lisbon, where there is now a Gulbenkian museum. And then you may have heard also of the Melkonian Institute in Cyprus. I don't know if you have or not, but the Garabet and Krikor Gulbenkian were natives of Gesaria. They had moved over to Egypt, and interestingly enough, we talked about, Barlow spoke about the First Republic that I've focused on. They gave all their wealth to the First Republic of Armenia in 1919, 1920, and they were granted Armenian citizenship, which was really something very special at that time. But because Armenia became a Soviet state, because the Turks took over half of it and the Soviets took over the rest of it, they turned around and gave their fortune to the AGBU with the stipend or the stipulation that it should be used for educational purposes for the youth, which is what they wanted it to be used in the First Republic. And so there was established the very important Melkonian Institute in Nicosia in Cyprus, which educated Armenian youth primarily from the Middle East, all the Middle Eastern countries for many, many years. This land dates back in Armenian history to before the time of the Christian era. There was in the 1st century BC well-known Armenian king, a brief emperor whose name was Dikran. And we call him Dikran Meds, Dikran the Great. He was in the 1st century BC, and he, with his father-in-law, the king of Pontus, took over much of Asia Minor. And he was able to capture Cappadocia, this region, Cappadocia, and for a time had a client kingdom, or a client king, until he was defeated himself by the Romans, and the Romans took over this whole region in the, come to the next slide, took over this region in the heartland. Well, no, can't. We're going to back up again. In any case, that's okay. When the Romans took it over, they themselves created some client kings. But then in the 1st century, the time of Jesus Christ, a Roman emperor decided that he wanted simply to annex it as a province. And Cappadocia in the 1st century, from the 1st century onward, became a Roman province. But there were Armenians living in that area, not so many, but Armenians living in that region. And it played a very significant role in Armenian Christian history. Those of you who have done your Sunday school know that the evangelizer of Armenia, Gregory, the Illuminator, Grigor Lusavoric, was reared in Gesaria. By the way, that first emperor that annexed it, the name of this place used to be known as Mazika, and he changed it to the name of the city of Caesar, because he was the Caesar, the emperor. And that's why we get the name Caesarea, and in Armenian, Gesaria, meaning the city of Caesar, you know, the emperor. And so it's the imperial city. In any case, by the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity had struck some rather deep roots here, and some of the most important Christian theologians of the 4th century that set the basis for orthodoxy, for Christian orthodoxy, were natives of this region of Cappadocia and Gesaria, and set the foundation. For example, if you go to the Armenian church, you do this, Havadam, the Nicene Creed. These bishops were those who pushed against others who had other points of view. But Gregory, the young prince, or the young boy, was raised under the tutelage of some of these early Christian fathers, and according to our tradition, then went to Greater Armenia, converted the king Dertad, and returned back to Gesaria, where he was ordained the very first bishop or primate of the Armenian church. So that this city and this district has a very long and important relationship with the Armenian people. Their numbers grew in leaps and bounds in the 10th and 11th centuries because of the invasions. The Arabs had already invaded, and then in the 10th and 11th century, the Turks, the Seljuk Turks, pushed in to the Armenian plateau and took over most of the Armenian principalities and kingdoms, and even the Greek Byzantine Empire, which was also Christian, but differently Christian, also went on a period of aggression and captured the last important kingdom on the Armenian plateau, the kingdom of Ani. As a result of that, thousands of Armenians left, either forcibly taken away or simply wanted to get out of the way of all the fighting that was taking place, and they moved westward into Sebastia, which is right next to, or Sivas now, right next to Cappadocia, and then they moved to Cappadocia itself, and many thousands of them. They, unlike today, when you don't think of Armenians really as being, well, maybe in Armenia they are being very warlike. The Armenians of those times were very warlike, and they had important divisions that they contributed to the Byzantine and other armies, and were well known for their military prowess. The area came under Turkish Ottoman, the Ottoman Turks who captured Constantinople in 1453 and created this great empire under which the Armenians lived for half a millennium. The Armenians lived in Kayseri and Gesaria and other areas of historic Armenia for nearly 500 years under Turkish rule. The Armenians of Gesaria were never a majority, but they were a significant element. In the city itself in the 19th century, there were probably about 60,000 people. And of those 60,000, 15 to 20,000 were Armenian, which means nearly a third of the population of Gesaria or Kayseri were themselves Armenian and were leaders. They were, I guess Armenians have always been hardworking and going ahead, and they started to become exporters and importers. Aside from making the best of Basturma that you could find, it was there. They established merchant houses in Venice, in Europe, and all the way to Manchester, England, exporting carpets, cotton, wool, tannery, leather, shoes. They were famous for this. And also, unlike their Muslim neighbors, they became among the first to seek education and enlightenment. Now, Gesaria is not Constantinople, and Gesaria is not Izmir, Smyrna, which were really pioneers, and they had this huge movement toward enlightenment and education. Gesaria was a bit slower, but nonetheless, by the end of the 18th century, in the 1700s already, they had created their first boys' school, and very enlightened, I suppose, for the times. In the middle of the 19th century, by 1840s, 1850s, they had schools for girls, which, as you know, in that part of the world was not very common. So they were forward-looking in that sense, and interesting enough, today we talk about divisions in the Armenian community. I got news for you. Let's go back to Gesaria, and we have the best divisions that existed. There was the Frankoğlu family, and the Manugian family, the Manugoğlu family, who were two very wealthy families that feuded continuously through the 19th century and had their followers. You know, you belong to that church and well, I belong to this church, and that's exactly how it was, because one of the factions supported Surpasvadzadzin Church, Holy Mother of God, Holy Mary Mother of God, and the other one supported Grigorlu Savorich Church, which is Gregor the Illuminated Church, and that feud went on until the end of the 19th century when it was finally resolved. The Armenians of Gesaria are interesting because those who lived in the city, that 15 to 20,000, for whatever reason, maybe external pressure, maybe because of their daily lives, eventually lost the Armenian language and spoke Turkish. That was the common language of the Gesaratsis from the city, is that they would speak Turkish. But interestingly, the villages, the Armenian villages around Mount Argyos, still maintained their Armenian dialect. The Tomarzatsis still spoke with their Tomarza dialect, and the Chomaklatsus spoke with their own, the Evkeretsis. So it's interesting that village life, in the village life, they maintain their Armenian traditions and Armenian ways more than they did in the city itself. In every village and in every town, there was at least one Armenian church, at least one apostolic Armenian church, and in the 19th century, increasingly as the American and other missionaries made their presence felt, they also established a Protestant community, much smaller, but a community that also established its own school, and in some cities also a Catholic community. And the Catholics are sort of third when it comes down to religious division. And for example, well, like in any number of the villages you can tell whether it's Tomarzau, Chomaklu, you have a Protestant community, and usually these communities also maintain their own schools. Maybe 30 students, 40 students, 50 students, but they did that, and they gave the resources to this kind of education. At the turn of the 20th century, the Armenians began to feel the rising tide of Turkish nationalism. Mr. Dermagrdician spoke about the genocide that we are commemorating this week. And in many ways it started in Gesaria long before 1915, as it did in many other areas of historic Armenia. In 1895, there took place the first big pogrom or massacre of Armenians throughout the historic homeland, not under the later Young Turk regime, but under the last of the important sultans of the Turkish Empire, whose name was Abdülhamid II, who didn't want the European, didn't like Armenian enlightenment, didn't like Armenian demands for equality, didn't like Armenians seeking external support, and decided he needed to teach them a lesson by conducting a widespread massacre of Armenians, not anyone politically involved necessarily, but anyone that was an Armenian. In that year, at least 100,000 Armenians were killed in the Ottoman Empire. Armenian sources tell us 200 to 300. I take the minimum of a German missionary who gives us 100,000. And at the same time, the looting and burning of the Armenian quarters. In any kind of genocidal action, there is the economic factor, economic jealousy, and wanting what the others have. That is, you riot and you take over. And so the Armenian marketplaces, and the Armenians controlled, along with their Greeks, the Greeks were also significant in the area, but they controlled the center of the market. Even a small town such as Everek, which is to the south of the Argeos mountain. In the bazaar, there were 150 shops, of which 140 were owned by the Armenians. So it shows you what, the importance of the economic aspect. In Gesaria, the deaths were first reported to be 1,000 people killed in 1895, but then it came down, and part of the reason was that some Armenians, young people, had begun to learn how to seek means for self-defense. They were, most of them belonged to a new political party known as the Hanchagian Party, and were able to organize self-defense units so that the death toll in Gesaria was minimal compared with other areas where thousands were killed in 1895. But Armenians recovered very quickly. They recovered after 1895. The markets went back, and there was a great deal of optimism, especially after 1908, when a new government known as the Young Turk government overthrew Abdülhamid and established what they said was going to be a regime of equality and liberty and justice. And of course, if you're a minority, what else would you want but liberty, equality, and justice? But unfortunately, things went sour, and those Young Turks turned into ultranationalist, xenophobic opponents of all other groups, and wanted to create a new empire that didn't, no longer would be based on many different peoples, many religions, many different languages, and moving toward creating a single country, as they have done now, that was based on one language, one people, one culture, and one religion. At least that's what they thought. We see now that there are a lot of other cultures that are bubbling back up and wanting to be recognized, but that's brought us to 1915. And that was, of course, the tragic year for both Gesaria, the city, and the villages. As a matter of fact, at a time when the Armenian genocide is taking place everywhere. The Armenian villages of Gesaria were first to be victimized. For example, in July of 1915, the entire village of Çomaklu, with nearly 2,000 inhabitants, was emptied and driven southward towards Syria and then down toward Homs and Hama and internal Syria. At the same time that Derevenk and other villages were. And the city of Gesaria itself came the next month. In August of 1915, they deported or killed almost the entire Armenian population. After the war, after 1918, they returned. Some of them returned, survivors returned. But now there was the rise of a new Turkish movement known as the Turkish Nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal, and there was very little room for, again, minority populations, and most Armenians of Gesaria left and moved to Istanbul or Constantinople and then spread around the world. A small number, maybe a few hundred Armenians, remained in Gesaria through the 1950s and 1960s, because in the city of Gesaria was and is one of the still remaining working Armenian churches, known as Surp Grigor Lusavorici, St. Gregor the Illuminator's Church. And now, without the Armenian population, since most of them have left, they still come back with the Patriarchate from Istanbul, comes in and at least has a mass, a badarak, at least once a year in order to maintain it as a working church. The two other churches of Gesaria, one is Surp Sarkis, is totally demolished. We don't know where it is, or maybe we know, but it's gone. And the mother cathedral is known as Surp Asvazadzin. It's been turned into a gymnasium, and we'll see some of these here. I think rather than continuing, I don't want to burden you with history, except to say it was not a huge community. In the province or the county of Gesaria, there were about 70,000 Armenians living in the city itself and in about 20 villages all around the great mountain. We shouldn't think of all the Gesaratsis as being wealthy people. Most of them were not wealthy. Most of them were poor farmers, and they began in the late 19th century to become bantuks. Bantuks are those who would leave their home, particularly young men, and go to the big city. They would go to the big city to earn a dollar and live under very difficult circumstances, and then send the money back to the village for their family and for the village establishments. And they came all the way to the United States, these bantuks. For example, if you've heard of the village of Tomarza, many of these people came to the agricultural machinery works in Racine, Wisconsin. And they still live there in Racine, their descendants live in Racine, Wisconsin. From Çomaklu, they came to Evanston, Illinois, they came to New York City, and they also came eventually, as you know, to the San Joaquin Valley, and established this very wonderful, lush area known as Yetem, with all its vineyards and gardens. The Bantuks, the sojourners, once they came to America or to Istanbul or to France, didn't forget their home villages. They remembered them, and the first thing, for example, I'll give you an example of Çomaklu. When there were only 10 Çomaklutsi men in New York City, they banded together already at the early 1900s and created the Çomaklu Educational Society, which went on for very many years. And the purpose for that was, even though they were working and living in these boarding houses with 6 or 8 men in a room, they still wanted to collect money to send back for their schools, to enlighten their children. And in Çomaklı, again, it's true everywhere, there were two schools, in the Armenian schools. And Çomaklı is on, because it's, all these villages are around the mountains, so Çomaklı had a lower quarter and an upper quarter, and each one had its Armenian school upper quarter and Armenian school lower quarter. Each one had its own church, and we may see some examples of that. And so the Çomaklıs continued their connection with their homeland, even at a time when they were several thousand miles distant from them, which shows their strong homing sense and instinct that they have, and wanting, even in their very, very dire and meager conditions, to contribute to the improvement of their own people. 1915 was more than an injustice. It eliminated this community along with hundreds and thousands of other communities. And the blow was so hard that they never recovered. Armenians have always been able to recover, and that's what's different about the 1915 genocide, is that was the blow from which the Armenians could not and did not recover. Every other one, with thousands of soldiers and numerous invasions, taking away thousands of people into captivity and slavery, there were always enough there dedicated to rebuild and continue. And the Young Turk policy of annihilation, elimination with modern technology brought this to an end. I didn't want to stop on this dark note, but rather now to have some visual images of Cappadocia, this area in the heart of Asia Minor, and of the Mount Argios, the Turks call it Erciyes, and the villages around it. So let's lower the lights and take a quick tour. You know what, before we do that, I want to show a 5-minute video. It's not great, that my daughter Ani made. When we went there last year, she's made much better ones, but the subject matter, you have to have good subjects. Not great, but I told her I would show it and test it in this Fresno-friendly audience, who can tell us what they think of it. Let's see let's see Gesaria, the disc. Have we put that in? Yes. All right. Yeah. All right. That and then we'll go to the slides. And if you want, we can do it later, Barlow, at the end. That's it. Could you get the light? Yes, it's sound. We have to go back. Can we? Yeah, we can walk through turn up the sound. Maybe you have to put the microphone next to it. Well, it's in the. Actually, now we Cappadocia, historic wonderful. This is Cappadocia. Have been here from before the beginning of the Christian era. Some of us. It's coming out of the speakers, not out of rock hewn churches, which is indicative of the persecution. Yeah, well, we can't do it right now.
No, that's going to be worse.
Right. The city of Gesaria.
It's just what it was recorded very low levels.
We don't have speakers. In any case, here are the people of Gesaria in the 19th century. This is the village of Efkere to the north of it, and I'm sorry, we don't have a amplifier. This is the church of Sucricorlu Savoric, St. Gregory the Illuminator. It's one of the few churches in Asia Minor that still operates.
Named after St. Gregory.
was educated here and returned here to be ordained as the first bishop of Armenia in the early 4th century.
And what are these buildings here?
These are the old Armenian sections. Right now there's gypsies and Kurds.
Old Armenian section where gypsies
These
are
are the
living.
old Armenian quarters of Gesaria, covered with grapevines and history, and the children of today with their chicks.
So this whole district was mostly Armenian. These houses are just the surviving 6 or 7. They're exceptional now because of the
Here are some old Armenian homes.
Hundreds more like it.
Armenian merchants.
Were 7 families, like present-day townhouses, and the plaques on the doors are the names of the Armenian families who lived here.
Interesting enough, the city of Gesaria became Turkish-speaking. The villages around it, there were numerous villages around it, they still maintained the Armenian language.
Հայերու երմիր գյուղը, երբ Սուրբ Սարգիսի եկեղեցին. Where are we?
We're at Evkere. That's the old name. It's now the new name is Gesi. There's lots of evidence of what happened. For Evkere, there's a lot of evidence. You've got the church, you've got all the ruined buildings, but in other places maybe only there's a little bit of evidence, but none at all sometimes. And between when I first came to Turkey in the 80s and today, the visual signs have become much harder to see. This is like a monument to the genocide. Here.
It's a church of Evkere that still stands, Sub Stepanos.
So genocide, you should be taking more care. I don't find that Armenians take care.
How do we do that though?
You have to you should be spending more time here, just appreciating what is here at the moment, because it might not be here in 10 years or 15 years.
Down below is Gesaria, sprawling metropolitan city it's become. And to the left is the village of Talas, where Gulbenkians had a home. I believe it's that home. There it is. That's where they lived. All right, and this is the American Missionary School.
We're at the American school in Talas, which was attended largely by Armenian children and Greek children. This was largely a Greco-Armenian town. We see the remnants of old Armenian homes, very nicely built, without Armenians.
This woman's father has been here 40 years. She teaches English in Kayseri.
Oh.
And she's remembering the Armenians fondly. Yeah.
How do you remember them?
I don't remember them. I have heard about them. And I know that people in Talas used to love them a lot. They were neighbors, and they taught each other their food, culture, etc.
And when they remember the Armenians fondly, do they also remember why the Armenians are no longer here?
Yes, yes. They are sorry for what had been done. We are not responsible for that.
Not the government.
We are not responsible for that, but when we hear those kind of things, we are very sorry. We are very sorry. In fact, about that Kete, I heard many stories from her, because she used to live here when the American college was here.
Right. She was Turkish or
She was
the child of an
Turkish,
Armenian?
Muslim.
Right.
In fact, she was covered head. She had covered head, and she used to cry for the Armenian friends she had. There are two kinds of people: good people and bad people. No nation, no religion. This is my idea, and I would like to thank all of you for remembering the past and coming here to see here.
Well, yeah, you might or might not like what she had to say, but it's of interest, I think. So, all right. Thank you. We'll take your criticism later. But now if we can go back to the PowerPoint. And I'll just sit here and talk, Barlow, while you work, okay? All right, look at Gesaria, Caesarea, and around it. You see up above is Yozgat, and then Ankara, and then you have to go all the way to the east. Sepastia and Malatya, where there's the Euphrates River, and it's east of the Euphrates that the Armenian highland begins. So it's the very next province, and then you go down to Adana there, and that's Iligia, Cilicia, which is, of course, an area of the last Armenian kingdoms. And as I said, my last volume was on Smyrna, which is all the way to the west, and Constantinople, because of their importance as Armenian communities. Next. Here is Mount Argios, the holy mountain of Gesaria, a painting, but quite accurate rendering. Next. And here you see the city of Gesaria, beginning of the 19th century, the mountain in the background, and there were about 120 small neighborhoods, of which 25 were inhabited primarily by Armenians. Next. Here is Cappadocia. It's an area really quite interesting, as I mentioned, an early area of Christianity, and the stones are so soft that the early Christians built chapels inside them. And if you've been to Gerart in Armenia, you know what I'm talking about, where they've hewn the hard rock or soft rock to make chapels. Next. And here you see the hewn rock. Next. And inside the Orthodox chapels. These are primarily Greek Orthodox. Next. George, St. George. And Pancreator, major in one of the larger of these. They go from very small to quite large. Next. Kayseri is showing you a population of 1 million people. Now it's even this was taken 3 or 4 years ago. They increase 20, 30, 50,000 every year. Next. This is what the old walls of the city, and what's left of the old walls of the citadel. You can still find remnants of it. Next. And the archway into the city. Next. Here is Sup Krikor Lusavoric. Next. And next. And you see the entrance. And the carvings, decorative. The altar of the church. Next. And here you, interesting. This was my second or third trip. The two rich Gesaratsis in Istanbul had sent money for the renovation of the church, and so you see the church now being renovated at their expense. Next. These are the buildings right next to the church. This was the school. And you can see, if you read Armenian and can see closely enough, it says Sarkis Gumshan Varjaran. So it was this wealthy Armenian who created this school for the sort of lower class people. And at the turn of the 19th century, there were 700 students in this school. The Gumshan kindergarten. And the local gypsies sitting around the church now. Here are the old houses of the wealthy Armenians. There used to be blocks and blocks of these, but the city of Gesaria, or Kayseri now, is preserving 6 or 7 of them as historical monuments. This is before they started the renovation, and you can see next. Here they are already renovating these several mansions of Armenian merchants. This is just one house, the internal courtyard. Next. And you can see the fine decorations on the eave. Next. Next. And the balcony. The Armenian wealthy elite the merchant class were patrons of art and wanted to have particularly fine pieces. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries in particular, the Armenian silversmiths made these covers for Bibles and holy books with silver and enamel or gems. Here, and you have an example of a cover of a book, and in the book that the volume I just published, there is a long chapter by Sylvie Marion from New York with about 30 pages of pictures of the work of these. Here are the metalsmiths. You can see the Armenian writing on the back spine, and then biblical scenes on both the front and back. Next. Another example. And now we're at the what was the Armenian cathedral in the center of the city. This is St. Mary, Holy Mother of God Cathedral. Here's the cupola. Next. And now here we are inside. And you can see over on the right, they're having a judo class for young children. And there is some talk now of converting it to a mosque. This is the Armenian Protestant Church of Gesaria at that time, and this is what's left of the Armenian Protestant Church of Gesaria. And here the Armenian school, one of the several schools, 1912, the teachers and the graduates of this women's high school, the class of 1912-1913, the next to the last class of graduates that the school graduated. Here is a typical wedding scene from 1900-1910. This one is unusual because there are a lot of women in it. Usually the wedding pictures have only the bride and groom and a lot of men. So this was a very, and look how progressive they are, the hairdos of the women and their dress, whereas most, of course, of the population there were covered with their charshafs, with their sheets for the Muslim women, and these were the Armenians who were distinguished. Next. And here is a more typical wedding picture, with the bride and groom and maybe one or two other close family members. Next. Here are some of the handiwork. One of the authors of this volume, Tina Demirjan, has collected these from her grandmother's trousseau. Next. The crochet with a cross in the center. And a man's outerwear. And the slippers in which her grandmother was married. Now here we are, a closer up map, and here you see Mount Argeos or Ergias, that is nearly 13,000 feet in elevation. That's just about 3,000 feet lower than Ararat. So in that area you can see it from 30-40 miles around. If you go up to the top, then we see some villages: Munjasun, Efkere, Tablusun, Derevenk, Talas, and then over to the left, Germir. I'm to the right, I'm sorry. Here, these are all Armenian villages, and you can see they're very close to the city, within about 5 or 10 kilometers. And then down below the mountain, if you come down underneath the mountain, here are these other villages of Evereg and Fenese. These are two twin cities. They're separate towns, and they were really rivals with each other. You know, everyone now thinks that they are one place, but the Everexes and Feneses had a lot of competition. The people from Fenese felt like they were second class, and because the people from Evereg had more money and a better school. And then next to that is Chomachlu, up above Chomachlu, and then Injesu, Jujun, and then the very, very large village or town of Tomarza, right there. And there are a number of other villages as well around there. Next. This is Talas on a hillside, and you see one of the Armenian churches there. Next. This is Sevag Tateosian church. It doesn't exist anymore. A bride and groom from Talas at the turn in the year 1900. And here, these schools are interesting. These schools for girls were supported by Armenian women's societies in Constantinople, and so they advocated advanced education for the girls. And here we have the kindergarten there. This is the Kubishan school, again a wealthy merchant who creates a secondary school in Talas. Next. And the American School for Boys, which we saw in the video. Next. And here it is today, still a very stately school, which the missionaries turned over to the Turkish government. Next. Next. And here you see the Gulbenkian, what was the Gulbenkian mansion. As I look, it seems to me that it's uninhabited. I cannot tell. And I've heard, and I'm not sure it's true, that there are plans to turn it into a boutique hotel. And here you see the city, the modern city of Kayseri. Remember that in our time it was a city of 60,000 people. Now it's more than 1 million, and it's taken over many of the small villages in the area. This is a place known as Derevenk, and here's the entrance to this Vank, our monastery. Next. The village of Germir with its church of Surp Stepanos. And here you see in the foreground the backside of that church, still standing. And then way on the other side is the Greek church, also still standing. The Greeks were forcibly were forced to leave in 1922 in a population exchange. They were forced to go to Greece, and Turks living in Greece came here. Here is a picture of the altar of Surp Stepanos, and here it is today. Next. This was a pride of the Gesaratsis. It is their Surp Garabed Vank, and it's a high school and seminary to prepare priests. And you can see it's an extensive complex, very close to Efkere, about 5 miles out north of Gesaria itself. Next. Here you see one section of that monastery. Next. And this was the abbot who established it as a seminary. Next. Here are some of the graduates from the year 1904. And here are the students from, I believe it's 1912, 1913, or perhaps 1913, 1914, which tells us they were the last, and probably most of them didn't survive the year 1915. This is that same monastery today. That's what's left of it. You can see it in the a few arches over to the right and some bricks to the left, but this huge complex is now gone. The local people take bricks away to build their houses. This is the city of Efke, and if you look right to your left, you see the church there of Surp Stepanos. Next. This is Efkere now. Most of the city is gone. And here, look at the hillside. You can see where the Armenian homes had once been. You see they're sort of plateaued into different levels. That's where the Armenian homes were, and now you just have the hillside. This was the church of Surp Stepanos of Efkere, yes. Next. And this was the interior altar. Next. And here you see the church today. It still stands without its windows, but impressive compared with other churches which have been totally demolished. Next. Here you see that same altar where there's a tree growing where the altar once was, but some of the frescoes and paintings are still there. Next. All right, again, we're now going to look at some of the villages. Let's reorient ourselves. As I said, there's Gesaria, and now we're going to go to the villages toward the south around Mount Argeos. Next. Next. You can see no matter where you are, you see the mountain. And no, you know, you can take a circle around it. For 30 or 40 miles, this is what you see. This is one of the picture I put on the cover of the Gesaria book, except that I had one that says Basturma and other things which are local. Here is the Tomarza, the Vank of Tomarza, Surp Asvazazin, and here you can see on a pilgrim day, the villagers have come out to their rather impressive church for a village church, a Vank, a monastery. And here it is today. Next. And there it is today. Next. And there it is today. And again, from Tomarza, there's the mountain, as I say. Tomarza had, in the city, had also the church of Bogos Pedros, the church of Paul and Peter, we would say Peter and Paul. You can see that all the archways have been bricked up. Next. This is the church. Next. And this is how it looked in 1913. And surprisingly, look at how beautiful it is. This is how it still looks today, after 100 years. The vibrant, deep blue colors are still there. And here we have, you know, a pickup that is parked inside one of the apses of the church. Again, now we're in somewhere known as Jujun, a typical village, but again the mountain is there. Next. Next. And here we find a village known as Injesu. You see that probably that spring has been there since Armenian times. Next. And look in the wall of the house, you see the Armenian cross that has now been incorporated into a wall. And here is the sign going towards Chumachlu, and look again at the mountain. And now we're going up to the village. Next. This was the Armenian school board of trustees of the lower school, and the next one is of the upper school trustees and students. And here is the Armenian church, one of them, of the lower city. Next. And here's the Armenian church of the upper city, in which you, when you go inside, you go through about 10 feet of dung, because they use it obviously for their animals as a stable. Next. And you see the dung that they dry, they use this for fuel, this as they do in Armenia, and they have it all over. I mean, it's just everywhere. Next. And the current residents, and again you see in the walls the Armenian writing and inscriptions that no one knows what they are, they're just there. And finally, the final view of Chomachlu again, from the village looking up toward the mountain, so you can understand why Der Garabed and why the Chumaklutsis had their monthly or annual journal that was known as Argeos. This is now Fenese, the village of Fenese. You see the church steeple. This was St. Tora, the two churches actually. Surp Toros was the main church here, or Theodore. Next. One of their very advanced teachers who was brought in to enlighten or to compete with Evereg and to make it a first-rate school. It's the Hovannisian school. And here are the teachers and a few graduates of the Hovannisian school of Fenese. This is the Hovannisian school. And now we're in Evereg, where the church also has the same name of Subtoros, is still existing, converted to a mosque. And if you look forward, there is a panel, a white panel, next, And underneath the panel, you'll see a painting, a Christian painting. And the folklore is that when the Muslims took it over, you know, they whitewash everything when they make it a mosque. And the story is that they whitewashed it several times, and the image of the painting still came out. And so they thought this was a sign by God, and they allowed it to stand by putting a white plaque or plank over it. Next. Here you see it closer in the church of Toros, Theodore. And here is on the walls of the church or the mosque that has been rebuilt, again, the Armenian stones, funerary stones that are a part of it. And here are the Armenian houses. Look at the key that she's using for the entrance. The last Armenian Everek died a few months before we made this trip. And this is Toros of Fenese, what's left of it, in its crumbled state. Now, finally, again, let's look at this map, because I want to go a little farther afield. North of Gesaria, immediately north of Gesaria, is Boğazlayan. And then north of that is Yozgat. And north of Yozgat is Çorum. And I want to just show you a few slides, because these had significant Armenian communities as well that were all annihilated. You can see they're not very far from Ankara. And they're about as far as you can get away from any war zone, from any sea. And so the excuse that Armenians had to be removed from the war zone simply doesn't hold, because this entire population was deported, and especially in Yozgat, they had a terrible, terrible governor who enjoyed and reveled in his cruelty. And interesting enough, here the Turkish-speaking Armenian Catholics and Protestants were among the first victims. This was a mock-up of the church of Boğazlayan. You see, it was quite large. Next. This is the city of Yozgat as it was in around 1900. The Armenian bishop and deacons of Yozgat. The Armenian Protestant ministers, they had many villages with Armenian Protestant churches, and here you have a convocation of Armenian Protestant ministers in Yozgat. Next. A typical family, a Yozgat Armenian family in around 1900, probably pretty well off. This is the old clock tower as it now stands. And there's a very wealthy family that's known as the Aslanian family from Yozgat. This was their home. And finally, a church was either Greek or Armenian, I'm not sure which, again, has been converted. Next. And finally, Çorum, which is to the north, with its bishop and Agas, they're wealthy men. And finally, I guess we need to say so long to this beautiful mountain of Argeos, Ergias, that was an inspiration and gave life to thousands of Armenians over many generations. Thank you.